Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor. Today I want to mostly talk a little bit more about this incredible group of journals that I've been reading by an artist called Anne Truitt. I spoke in some detail in the previous video about the three journals that are now available as one volume. Daybook, Turn, and Prospect, which I highly recommend. And I mentioned that I enjoyed Daybook the most, but looking back at those three, I really love them all. Today I'm talking about Yield mostly. Yield is the fourth and last of her journals, and it was published posthumously, edited by her daughter Alexandra Truitt. So think about this. Yield covers this time span, winter of 2001 to spring of 2002. That means that Anne Truitt was around 81 years old when she was writing this particular journal. Now remember from the previous video that she began writing her journals at the age of 52. So think about it this way. Her first journal, Daybook, encompassed the year that her first grandchild was born in 1978. That means when I'm sitting down and reading Yield all the way in the 2000s, that oldest grandchild that she has is now about 23 years old. So the little boy, the little baby that she was talking about all those years ago is now popping over to her place. You know, he's graduated university, he's got a job, he's coming to visit grandma and talk about art and his life. It's not often, I think, that you can have such access to a journal. Now, I need to add a few things, though. She is giving an account of her life as an abstract artist, a sculptor, while simultaneously, really weaving in moments of her life as a ex-wife, and then mostly mother, memories of being a daughter, and then being a grandmother. And what interests me the most is her mothering and grandmothering in tandem with the way her art progresses, the way she changes her views or keeps her views about these aspects of her life. And it's very refreshing and feels very, very new for a couple of reasons. First of all, because she's a superb writer, and also she has a gift, I feel it's a gift, to really look into herself and try to figure out all the time. She's trying to figure out, what do I feel? What do I think about her art, about her children? Questioning herself, planning her next move, whatever it might be. So there's that aspect, together with the fact that she's writing, when she first started writing these journals, and I feel really till the end, that she wasn't writing them for future publication, and she wasn't writing them out of a sense of, I need to discipline myself to keep a diary so I remember things. It wasn't that. It was an urge, a natural urge she had to look deeper into these aspects and put them into writing. And it does really feel like we're almost inside her mind. with the addition that she's a private person in many respects, so it's obvious that she's not talking about some things, and it feels quite natural that she's not talking about some things. And I'm certain that her editing of the journals, as she realized that they would probably continue to be published after the first one was, I'm sure that she edited that with that in mind. Now, together with all of that, I should mention that Yield, and if you do want to buy Yield, it is a separate book from the other three, is written in a with less narrative structure, is the best way to put it. You can tell that Anne Truitt has aged to a certain stage where her writing has naturally changed. She's somewhat more concise, sometimes jumps from day to another day without necessarily going into, a segue or anything like that. I found it very refreshing because, I'm using that word again, refreshing, because I think that's what it's like as you age. You do write in a different way often. And after reading these 4 journals, and especially this last one, I feel tremendously privileged that I had these journals to read, and I'm 100% sure I'm going to reread them. I'm also quite sad, and even talking about it makes me quite sad. It reminds me of older people I've lost in my life. It definitely reminds me of my own grandparents, and their presence in my life. And I feel a closeness also to the artistic sensibility of this woman who, in her journals, presents her artistic life in her own way without succumbing to certain socially expected arguments that a female artist often has to contend with. I'll tell you what I mean. If you're a female, now she was born in 1921, she died in 2004. Think about it, being a female artist during those decades. She must have come across a lot of misogyny. She must have come across a lot of critics who really worked against her and her artistic instinct and her ambition. She writes about it a little bit here or there. It's not as if she turns a blind eye to it, but it's not at all at the center of her journal. It's not the focus of her attention. The focus of her attention is always categorically her own artistic persona. As it changes, as it fluctuates, and it makes me realize how I don't think I've come across in my reading so far many other female artists who choose to do that. Now, when you choose to talk about the difficulties of being a female artist, you're necessarily talking about men and the argument you have with them, which is fine if you want to do that, but the entire book becomes really a book about men, because you're never making enough space for yourself to talk about yourself. And I keep referring back to Parade because it had such a huge impact on me, both positive and negative. And I don't really know that much about the safe space in which Rachel Cusk wants to work on her art, for example. I don't think that was her aim, but how refreshing that it was Anne Truitt's aim. And it really was only towards the end of her third journal that it suddenly occurred to me, oh, I understand now what she meant about, her salary. She mentioned offhand that her salary wasn't, that she wasn't being paid the same as her colleague who was male at the university where she taught. I think it was the University of Maryland. I'm not sure. And she fought it in the courts. It's just a tiny paragraph. She got her lawyers to, try to sue, and she ran out of money. She couldn't pay her lawyers anymore. She just decided to leave it. It wasn't like, and it was just a few sentences, and it was only afterwards I thought, oh, that's actually a rather big deal. And then she mentions a book, that was published about certain abstract artists working in America at the time that she was, and she was left out of it, but it wasn't meant to be left out, or there was something, she was still friends with her. It wasn't a big, she mentions it as an aside. I almost glossed over it in my reading because, frankly, it's much more interesting to hear about what she's working on, what she's thinking about. And also many, many men that she names who help her, who notice her when she's just starting out, who take a chance on her, to whom she can turn when she's in trouble and she needs to have a retrospective because she feels like she's being forgotten about, and etc. So I highly recommend this book. You could just read Yield on its own, but I think starting from Daybook and moving forward is the best way. I mean, that's how I did it, so that's all I know. After I read Yield, I went to YouTube to see what sort of discussions there were in videos about her work. There's a short video showing her work. I might link to it. Showing her working in her studio. But mostly there were panel discussions that had, her daughter was there, and then, certain art critics or gallery owners who at the time had a lot to, do with her or with her friends. But I have to say I switched off after a few minutes. I don't really feel like watching those because reading her journals makes me realize what a difference there is between the world of publicity, the art world as we know it. So it's really the world of criticism, discussion, and publicity and marketing, and the inner world of the artist. And of course they have to meet. But it made me realize that when you've got these journals, everything else pales in comparison. And also, I'm seeing certain aspects of art differently now because I see them through her eyes. She mentions she makes so many allusions to so many works of literature as well as works of art from the past, from her present, and the minute she mentions anything or anyone, I'm writing it down and seeing, she loves a particular self-portrait by Rembrandt. And I'm telling you, I'll never look at Rembrandt in the same way again after having her write about it. She also has a particularly unique and fascinating way of looking at different aspects of her life using analogies of, interestingly, army maneuvers and Antarctic explorers and, sort of men who lived and wrote in the, BCE. So, for example, she turns to Cicero. I mean, who else would do that? Okay, I think this is in the last journal. As she's getting older, she writes, "When I wake up in the middle of the night, I read the works of the Roman orator Cicero, specifically his essay on old age." Now, I have a book of Cicero's orations and essays, which is my grandpa's. So now I'm never going to look at this book the same way again. I'm never going to look at this book the same way again. Because I remember when 11 o'clock at night when I was reading her journal in bed, I ran to the library, I got this book out. I saw, yes, I actually do have the essay on old age. And I'm certain that as I age now, I will read more and more of that essay. I've already started. She talks about a different angle. She talks about Tolstoy. She's very well read, so she talks about Tolstoy's characters. She says that she recounts how she was having lunch with her second daughter, Mary. What they were chatting about was Tolstoy's characters being sustained by their work. So she's putting herself, you see, in the mainstream of classical thought, philosophy, and literature. These great men from the past are her companions. She belongs in that world. She never questions it. And it's part of her everyday world. So when she's talking to her daughter Mary about how she feels that her artistic work sustains her, and Mary might feel the same way about her own work, she brings up the book Resurrection. Now again, I have Resurrection by chance in my grandpa's library, and I'm not really like, do I really want to pick it up? Normally, it's not one of Tolstoy's most famous works, and it looks like a lot of hard work, but if Anne Truitt is talking about it, I'm definitely going to start reading it. So I have to mention her enthusiasm for Shackleton and generally Antarctic explorers. She uses many of the adventures that she has read about through the years that really happened to compare to help her through difficult parts of her life. And one in particular was she says, I'm just reading my notes here. She says, "I have a photo of Ernest Shackleton's grave on my desk at all times." I mean, what an interesting woman. Isn't that fantastic? He's her favorite of all the early Antarctic explorers. And she does think to herself at one point, I think this is actually in the preface to Prospect. So it's in one of the earlier. Prospect is the third journal. So in the preface, she discusses what produces ego strength. And she's really looking at herself and saying, what is it that makes me keep going? How can I help myself keep going? But how do I understand myself more as well? And so she talks about definitely an idea of what makes this idea of being a leader and being up to a point quite selfless, being very organized, being prepared for anything. But then she talks about this wave Shackleton experienced. I think his ship ran aground onto an iceberg, and he was in a lifeboat. I don't remember all the details, but in any case, Shackleton sees from a distance something that looks like a white fuzzy line on the horizon, and he thinks it means that the weather is clearing, and it's not. It means that there's a huge wave coming towards them. And apparently he survives that, and he writes about the experience of this huge wave. And he drives the boat straight into the wave, and at one point he said he feels that the wave is not moving. It's just perfectly still, and his boat is perfectly still on top of it. And for Anne Truitt, she sees her 1989 artistic crisis in that respect. And she says the difference with her is that she made her own wave. And what she's referring to is her desire to have her request of this gallery owner, who she knew for a long time, to have a retrospective of her work, because she wasn't making much money anymore, and people were forgetting about her. And so the exhibition was a wave that she made for herself to test herself, and it did indeed work. People noticed her again, and she was renewed. Yeah. And she says, the crest passing leaves the boat apparently stationary, gravity now holding her back. This is Shackleton talking about the boat as in the feminine. But then she adds, Anne Truitt adds, holding her back. For her, it was the being held that was of the utmost importance. That once she had this exhibition, she felt held again, that she could rest a little bit more easy, knowing that, art collectors would occasionally buy one of her sculptures, that she could continue to make a living, that she could continue to live off her art. And that is really a quite wonderful way to talk about, for her to talk about herself. I just thought it was superb. Now, moving on, it's hard to do because I miss her. Moving on from Anne Truitt and her beautiful journals, I went back and read a few Tomas Tranströmer poems. They seemed to fit very nicely following Anne Truitt's work. Now, I don't know if I've possibly mentioned him in passing. He's a famous, huge Swedish poet. I've been reading his poems now for about a month, and he's definitely a favorite of mine now. I want to do much more, I think an entire video on what I think about his poems, because I love them. But I'll just mention now that he's a good match for reading alongside or following Anne Truitt. And I thought about why. First of all, it occurred to me that they both trained as psychologists prior to becoming artists, him becoming a poet, her becoming a sculptor. And so perhaps that's why they have the insight or the intuition that comes from having studied psychology. And they both worked in the field of clinical psychology for a while. Tranströmer worked in prisons with young men, I believe. But it's not only that, it's also the way they view space and time, and color, actually, now that I think about it. And I'll put up one of the poems that I remembered. As I was reading Anne Truitt, I suddenly remembered this poem that I had read by Tranströmer. It's called Open and Closed Space. So I'll put it up. You know what? I'll read it. If not everyone likes to listen to poetry being read, so you can fast forward. You'll see when the graphic leaves the screen, and then you'll know. But I'll read it anyway because I want to. So this is Open and Closed Space by Tomas Tranströmer. With his work as with a glove, a man feels the universe. At noon he rests a while and lays the gloves aside on a shelf. There they suddenly start growing, grow huge, and make the whole house dark from inside. The darkened house is out in the April winds. Amnesty, the grass whispers, amnesty. A boy runs along with an invisible string that goes right up into the sky. There his wild dream of the future flies like a kite, bigger than his town. Farther to the north, you see from a hill the blue matting of fir trees, on which the shadows of the clouds do not move. No, they are moving. This so much reminds me of Truitt's writing and her sculpture, the way she sees her house, the way she sees the natural world around her house, the way, and really the boy running with the invisible string very much made me think of how she writes about her son, who's her youngest child. Open and Closed Space is a great title. I think she would have loved that poem, I imagine. I do. In any case, so there's that. Now, there are also two other quick mentions I want to make. There's another poet. Now, this poet I only started reading yesterday. I already know she's a favorite. I'm beginning to get a very strong feel now for what sort of poets I like, what sort of poetry I like, and to trust my own gut. And I have to thank one of my viewers, I believe it was Diana, who a couple of videos ago commented about how her first language is Spanish. And I asked her for some recommendations of writers, of poets, and she mentioned Ida Vitale. Well, Diana, thank you so much. So Diana mentioned that she had, Vitale had recently been translated by New Directions, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so I downloaded it on my e-reader, and I'm having the most wonderful time. I will dedicate possibly a whole video to this wonderful poet who's now available in English in such a great way. But I thought I would read and bring up one of her poems that just took my fancy. It's called Woman with Dog. You can walk ever so slowly, halt inexact, run from nothing to nothing, observe all that is absurd, lost, useless, stitch some cold onto each night, introduce syllables about living, about obstinate rebirth, resemble yourself. Your dog is your witness and your constant orphan. Because of him, solitude privileges you. You are allowed a ritual circuit, atrocious perhaps, drawn up by habit. If he were to fly, you could climb lightly through the air without a single eye to reproach you. Now, that might not be, typical of her poetry generally, but it's one that I just felt like reading today. And finally, another thank you actually to Diana, or Diane, I forget. She also mentioned a Japanese writer called Natsume Sōseki. Natsume Sōseki is known primarily as a novelist, but he was a poet as well. His years are 1867 to 1916. And because of this recommendation I received, I found a website that is dedicated to the translation of his poetry, and it's beautifully done by, I believe, the University of Florida. So I will leave a link to that, because if you're watching this and you enjoyed my discussion of where is it? And you enjoyed the discussion of this book, then you may well enjoy Natsume Sōseki's work, and it's readily available on this website, and it's not often that you can access something for free that's of such high quality. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to next week, and I remind you that the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye-bye.